Okay, well, Charlie, it's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with you and your colleagues there at Next Jump. I had the privilege and pleasure of having Charlie show me around Next Jump about a year ago, and I was really impressed with the electricity and the vision. And so it's a privilege to be able to speak with you today. And what I want to speak with you about is what Charlie was talking about, which is my passion, which is very simply, my passion is peace. Basically, how can we learn to live and work together to make this a better world so that it benefits everyone? Getting together had a vision, a radical vision, which was, which is known as the vision of win-win. It's better me plus you equals us. And today I would even extend that vision to being, the goal of negotiation, as I see it, the basic tool that we use is negotiation, and the basic goal of negotiation is what I would say win-win-win. In other words, a win for you, a win for the other side, be it the client or your colleague or whoever it is, your spouse, and a win for the larger whole, whether that's the family, whether that's the work organization, Next Jump, whether that's your community, whether that's your society, or whether that's the world. And to me, that's the goal. And over the last 30 or 35 years, I've had the privilege of watching a revolution take place in the world today, thanks to the communications revolution, of which Next Jump is obviously part, which is a revolution that accompanies the knowledge revolution. It's a revolution in the way in which we as human beings, we as individuals, we as organizations, and we as societies, the way we make decisions. Because traditionally, a generation ago, I would say, in most societies around the planet, the principal way of making decisions was very much top-down. The people on the top of the pyramids of power, they gave the orders, and the people on the bottom, we simply followed them. And gradually, through the influence of the communications revolution and the knowledge revolution and the internet, those pyramids of power are beginning to flatten themselves into networks, organizations that resemble networks, where the basic form of decision-making shifts from vertical decision-making, hierarchical, where the people on the top simply give the orders, to horizontal decision-making, where in order to get our jobs done nowadays, we are literally dependent on hundreds, thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people over whom we exercise no direct control. So we are, in a sense, we're compelled to negotiate. Negotiate is simply another name for horizontal decision-making. I invite you to think about this for a moment in your own experience. Think about, if I were to define negotiation very simply and very broadly, as the act of back and forth communication. You're trying to reach agreement with the other side. You have some interest with them which you hold in common, like, for example, an ongoing relationship with a customer, and you have some interest which maybe are intention, like you'd like to get more money for your services or products, and they would like to pay you less. In the broad sense of the term, in negotiation, you're trying to reach agreement on those kinds of conditions. So think about your own life, and think about, broadly speaking, who do you negotiate with today? Who do you try to engage in back and forth communication, trying to reach agreement with? Think about it. As Charlie was just mentioning, it might be your family, your spouse, your kids, your partners, your friends. Then you go into work, it's your colleagues, your boss, your staff, your clients, your suppliers, your partners, banks, governments, whoever you negotiate with. Think about it for a moment and ask yourself just one question. If you had to make a ballpark estimate, what percentage of your time do you think you spend, very broadly speaking, in the act of back and forth communication with your spouse, with your kids, with your partners, with your friends, with your colleagues, with suppliers, customers, and so on? What percentage of your time, what fraction of your time do you think you spend, if you think about it, either preparing for or engaged in the act of back and forth communication, trying to reach agreement on some issue, however small or however large? What would you say? Think about it for a moment. How many of you, just because I can see you there in the room there, how many of you would say it's over 25%? Raise your hand. There. Okay, keep your hands up if it's over 50%. Okay, all the hands just go up by about 75%. So, we don't always think about it as negotiation, but in the broad sense of the term, that's what we're doing from the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go to bed at night. And that's not even to speak of negotiating with ourselves, which is a whole other area. And so, think for a moment about the last, 5 years of your career, or 5 or 10 years, however you've been working there. Would you say that the amount of negotiating is going up, staying the same, or going down? I mean, what would you say? How many would say for a moment it's going up? How many would say you're actually negotiating more than you even were 10 years ago? Just out of curiosity, your hands up. Yeah. So that's the negotiation revolution. So if you think about it, these days, we're all decision makers. I mean, we're all making decisions together. And if you think about, take the 10 most important decisions you had to make in the last year. How many of them did you take by yourself, unilaterally, make the decision alone? How many of those 10 most important decisions did you actually have to reach with someone else? In other words, through some process of joint decision-making that we might call negotiation. Of the 10 most important decisions you had to make in the last year, how many of them did you actually have to negotiate? I mean, if you think about it for a moment there, I think you'll see that negotiation has become, in effect, whether we like it or not, the preeminent process for making decisions in the world, whether it's at home, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the neighborhood, the community, at school, whether it's in the world. And I see that revolution taking place recently. I visit on these farms. And the internet, the web, is actually making it even more vital. So the question is, how do we learn to do it better? And how can we negotiate optimal solutions? I mean, solutions that are genuinely satisfying to you, to the other side, and to the larger whole, be it next jump, or be it the society, the world, your family, the whole that you care about. How can we get to those win-win-win solutions? And the truth is not always easy. There are barriers in the way, there are obstacles. And what I'd like to talk to you about is just a couple, maybe let's say take 3 of those obstacles right now, and then I'd love to take your questions and see what's on your mind. But interestingly enough, if I had to take 3 obstacles, the first obstacle I would take in the 30 or 35 years, perhaps the biggest lesson for me is that the biggest obstacle we face to our success in negotiation is not what we often think it is. We often think it's that difficult person, that colleague, or that client, or that supplier, or that family member who's giving us a rough time. And to be sure, they can be difficult, no question about it. And I find that the biggest single obstacle to our success in negotiation is, guess what? Right here. It's us. It's very understandable, very natural, very human tendency to react. In other words, to act without thinking. To act in some ways that go contrary to our true interests. And I see that happen all the time in any conflict. You could imagine, as Ambrose Bierce once said it, when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. And we do that time and again. And now that, we have email, for example, it's so easy just to kind of like immediately respond. Someone sends you a memo you don't like. You immediately respond, you get that satisfaction. You press the reply button. Or what's worse is we press the reply all button, and then it goes out to the entire team, the entire organization, and then the conflict really starts to escalate. So the key in negotiation, the foundation of successful negotiation, is to do what I call, I give it a kind of a metaphor, I call it going to the balcony. It's almost as if you're negotiating on a stage, and part of your mind goes to a mental and emotional balcony overlooking that stage, where you can keep your eyes on the prize, you can get some perspective, you can see the big picture, and you can choose to respond rather than react. To respond in service of your true interests. So instead of hitting the reply all button, what you do is button on the screen that we rarely use the save as draft button. You know, you compose it, get it out of your system, but you save it. Then you do your favorite thing. I don't know, you go out, work out in the gym there, or you go for a walk, or have a cup of coffee with a friend, or you sleep on it for a night. But you get some perspective. And then you come back and you ask yourself, what is really going to serve my interest? Is it really going to be sending that memo to the entire organization? Or is it going to be walking down the corridor and talking to the person? Or, if that's not possible, just picking up the phone and calling them. There's so much more we can communicate with our voice and our presence that doesn't, lead to all this kind of misunderstanding. So just the ability to build a balcony to me is absolute key. Let me actually tell you just one story from me where I learned this lesson. Really, I was working, as Charlie mentioned, I sometimes work in these country political situations. I was working a number of years ago in the country of Venezuela, which international observers feared was on the brink of a civil war. You had 1 million people on the streets demanding the downfall of the president, Hugo Chavez. And then you had 1 million people on the streets of Caracas supporting him. And there was some violence, and there was people harming themselves, and it was getting very ugly. Anyway, I together with some others, I was involved. Anyway, at one point in this process that went on for a couple of years, I had a meeting, as I sometimes did, with the president of Venezuela, with Hugo Chavez, in his palace. We like to set the meetings at late at night, so it was at 9 o'clock at night, and I was waiting there, 9, 10, 11. Finally, at midnight, I got ushered in to see the president, expecting to find him alone. In fact, I found him surrounded by his entire cabinet arrayed behind him. And he said to me, "So, Yuri, what's your impression? How are things going? Pull up a chair here." And I said, "Well, Mr. President, I've been talking to some of your ministers here, I've been talking to the opposition, and I think I put a positive frame on it. I think, they're making some progress." And he said, "What do you mean, making progress?" He said, "You're not seeing anything. You're being fooled if you think you're making any progress. The other side, they're traitors. They're using all kinds of tricks. You're not seeing that." And he proceeded to explode at me and proceeded to lean in very close to my face and yell at me for approximately 30 minutes. So you can imagine, here I'm going, I'm not naive. I'm seeing this, and you get all this defensive voice going on inside you, and I'm feeling embarrassed in front of the whole cabinet or whatever. But then I remembered, I was about to say something, and then I remembered, wait a minute, what's my purpose here? I was able to go to the balcony. What is my purpose here? Is my purpose to get into an argument with the president of Venezuela? Is that really going to advance my interest here, which is trying to calm things down? And I realized no. So what I did was I just bided my time, bit my tongue, and just listened and listened and listened. And, when someone's angry like that, they can talk, but if you're not reacting, just listening and nodding and whatever, after about 30 minutes, he began to run out of steam, and I saw his shoulders sink down a little bit, which was a sign. In a kind of weary tone of voice, he said to me, "So, Yuri, what should I do?" And at that moment, I know that his mind was open. Before that, if I tried anything, we could have gotten into an argument, we could have gone on for hours. But at that moment, his mind was open to a suggestion. So I said, "I think, Mr. President, if I may make a suggestion, I believe the entire country of Venezuela needs to go to the balcony." In other words, this was around December, around Christmas time. The previous Christmas, all the festivities had been canceled in the country. Let's have a truce. Everyone celebrate Christmas with their families and just relax. And then in January we can pick up the conversation again. He said, "That's an excellent idea. I'm going to announce that in my next speech." And then he thought for a moment. He said, over Christmas I'm going to travel around the country, and I'd like you to come with me. Now his mood completely shifted from yelling at me to inviting me to go on a trip. He said, "No," but then he said, "But you're neutral, and maybe it wouldn't be so wise to be seen in your company. So if you like, I'll give you this guy." And what I learned from that incident was that maybe the greatest power that we have as a negotiator is the power not to react. It's the power to go to the balcony, think about what's really important here. Is it the client? Is it the spouse? Is it the family? What are we trying to do? Is it the relationship? So that we can stay focused, we can keep our eyes on the prize. Because in this busy world where we're
continually being asked to do more and faster, the ability to stay focused single-mindedly on what we're trying to achieve in negotiation is the foundation. So that's the first obstacle. A second obstacle, let's imagine you've gone to the balcony. Imagine the other side is not on the balcony. Imagine, the client is irate, the thing didn't come in time, or, something's not happening, something went wrong, and they're angry, and there's resentment, something they said the last time, and, you get into those kinds of arguments. Question is, how do you create a psychological atmosphere, an emotional atmosphere, so that you can actually reach a good agreement? And here, just as in Eastern martial arts, the greatest power that you have maybe in negotiation is the power of surprise. Do the opposite of what the other side expects. I have a friend who was working at the University of California in San Francisco, and his job was, he was like the complaint line, and so whenever there was a complaint at the university, he would have it, the radiation coming from the lab, there's no parking, the seats are being too loud, whatever it was. And he said his technique, what he learned, he gave me one of my classes, what he learned as a way of dealing with it, is what he learned is he would listen to the person, and then they would take a pause for breath, and then he would say to them, excuse me, but do you happen to have a pen and a piece of paper handy? And they would say, why? And he said, because I want you to have my personal telephone number. And anytime you continue to have a problem, just give me a call. And I'll hold it to us. You got my phone number. And they were so surprised. Wait a minute, they were expecting this kind of bureaucratic response. Only someone giving them their personal telephone number. And he said, that surprise bought him enough time to create a little bit of rapport. And that rapport allowed him to settle the situation off in his life. Well, I asked him, how many times did you get calls on your personal phone number? He said, well, the 5 years that I had the job, actually, the truth is, no one called me, with one exception, of course, but no one called me. And I said, well, why didn't they call you? He said, because I think, we created enough respect that they didn't want to bother me at home. I said, what was the one call? He said, well, the call where someone called me was to say that they were so impressed the way they've been handled on the phone that they wanted to offer me a job. So the power of being able to step to the other side, to put yourself in their shoes, to listen to them. And that's what negotiation is all about. To me, we think of negotiation, as Charlie was saying, it's the articulate, persuasive talker. But actually, negotiation is much more about listening than it's about talking. If you observe the behavior of successful negotiators, you find that they listen. We've got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. They listen at least twice as much as they talk, if not more. Because by listening, you can put yourself in the other side's shoes and try and find out what they really want. And that is the key in negotiations, to figure out behind their position, what is it that they're really concerned about? What are their real interests? What are their concerns, their fears, their needs, their desires, their aspirations? That we can do by listening. Listening also conveys respect. And as such, listening and respect, I think, are the cheapest concessions you can make as a negotiator, because they cost you nothing, but they mean a lot to the other side. So that would be a second tool. A third obstacle, if I had to name one, would be a rigid position. People go into negotiation and they say, okay, this is my position, this is my price, I'm not going to budge. One side takes a rigid position, the other takes a rigid position, they both begin to talk about not, you get nowhere, or make it a little concession here and there, but you get a suboptimal agreement usually on a positional bargain. The greatest power that we have in negotiation is the power to change aims. It looks like a negotiation spotlight. That spotlight can be on the side's position, the concrete things they say they want. Or you can move the spotlight and put it on what are their interests. Classic example from the founder, I think maybe the founder of modern in this country was Mary Poppins, who was entry. And she once mentioned he was in a Harvard library, and he was watching two students get into a quarrel in the library. Big fight, and, quarrel. One would go and open the window, the other would go and shut the window. One would go and open the window, the other would shut the window, and they were bothering everyone in the library. So then the librarian comes over, and she asks the first one, well, why do you want the window open? He says, well, I want some fresh air. She asks the second one, why do you want the window closed? He says, well, the draft and my papers around. So then she asks them the simple question, well, how do we get you fresh air without you a draft? The three of them talk about it for a bit. One of them says, I've got an idea. He disappears into the next room and opens a window there, thus providing fresh air for the first person without a draft for the second. In that very simple situation, think about what's going on. You start off as in any negotiation with positions. It might be price, it might be numbers, it might be the numbers of people you can hire, this position or that. In this case, it's open window or closed window. By asking the magical question, why? Why do you need that? What's that designed to serve? What's the underlying need or desire or fear or concern? In this case, the underlying interests were fresh air and no draft. And by identifying and uncovering those underlying interests, they're then able to come up with a creative solution. They're able to use their creativity, which is one of our greatest gifts, to not just divide up the pie, but expand the pie. In other words, come up with a creative solution that's good for both sides. In this case, an open window in the next room. And that's what you see successful negotiators doing time and again. Is there always shifts the conversation, the position. What are the underlying interests? But then instead of options, third the oh, that's how you get to win-win, or even better, to a win-win-win solution. And it's the power of asking the right questions. Questions like why? Help me understand what your needs are. Or if the other side doesn't want to tell you their needs, or their interests, because they think, hey, that's confidential. Sometimes you can get it by asking why not questions. In other words, what would be wrong with doing it this way? And oftentimes, the very people who don't want to tell you about their interests, they love criticize. So they'll say, I'll tell you what's wrong with your proposal. There's not enough money in it for us. It's going over the budget. Morale's going to go down. Quality's going to suffer. What are they doing? In negative form, in the form of criticism, they're telling you about their issues. So sometimes you want to actually invite criticism. Criticism is your ally in improving the deal. The whole purpose here in negotiations is to, I'd like to use a metaphor from the Chinese military strategist, Sun Tzu, who wrote, as you may know, The Art of War. And in it, he talks about the importance of building the other side a golden bridge. He was talking about a golden bridge to retreat across. I would frame it more positively in negotiations as a golden bridge to advance across. In other words, your job is to make it as easy, as attractive for the other to make the decision I'm offering to make. One of the most useful exercises I know in a difficult negotiation is to sit down and write out on one piece of paper what I call the other side's victory speech. In other words, imagine that the other side has accepted your deal, has accepted your proposal, has done what you want them to do. I mean, they said yes. Now imagine they have to go back and face the music. They have to go back and explain this to their board, their colleagues, their family, why they said yes to you. Write out the speech. In other words, what are the key bullet points? How could they explain accepting the agreement that you would like them to reach, the decision you want them to make? How can they explain that as a victory for their interests, that is good for them? How can they do that? If you cannot write out that victory speech in a persuasive way, then you've got some work to do, because you've got some, they're not going to say yes unless they can figure out some way that it works for them, and then they can explain it to other people so that it works for them. In other words, work backwards in the negotiation. Write out their victory speech, and then think about how you can help them give that victory speech, which is actually a victory for you. So that's the essence of negotiation. And what I'd really like to do, since negotiation is about putting yourself in the other person's shoes, is I want to put myself in your shoes right now and see if you have any questions and how this might apply in your own situation. I would welcome that.
Okay. Bill, so I'm going to start with Boston and go to London, San Francisco.
say the biggest mistake
Line muted.
I mentioned before is the mistake of reacting. The instant reaction. We tend to react, it's like fight or flight. We tend to react either by attacking back if we feel that we're being attacked. And then, it often goes into a situation where, as Gandhi once put it, an eye for an eye, and we all go blind. And we've all been in those situations where you end up attacking, you end up in a lose-lose situation. Both sides end up losing. In fact, the community ends up losing. A very good example is the kinds of, negotiations that have been going on in Washington, which, are lose-lose negotiations, and who loses the most, but the country and, in fact, the world by those kinds of negotiations. Or we react in another way, which is we react by giving in, which doesn't serve our interest either. Or we react by just walking out altogether in anger, and if that's an important relationship, so we have these kind of instinctual reactions, which is when we're under threat. We either attack back, we submit, we give in, or we run away. And, they all have a place in nature when you're fighting a saber-toothed tiger. But when you're dealing with a human being, those reactions rarely serve our interest. What's better is to be able to go to the balcony, take a moment, even if you've got just a moment, take a deep breath, count to 10, say, let me call you right back. Just take a moment. It could be a moment of silence, or whatever it is, whatever your favorite technique for going to the balcony is. You've got time, whether it's 30 seconds or a minute, and just take a breather, and then ask yourself, what is in my interest to do here? What's really going to serve my interest? And that way we can avoid what I call negotiators' regret, which is regretting what we just did and what we just said.
Greg, Boston?
Yeah, well, it depends a little bit on the situation, but let me give you a little bit of, I would say, in general, it's better not to jump to positions. It's better to start the conversation about the interest and say, let's not talk about price yet, because I don't even know what your needs are, So let me help understand what the customer's needs are. Let me tell you what we can deliver and what our concerns are and how we like to work here. And let's see if we can arrive at something. So, in other words, bring the conversation back to interest. Once you've mapped out the interest, and then you can even map out, if you like, explain to them this is the market value of things, and this is just to educate them about how much things are going to cost. And at that moment, then you can decide whether you want to invite them to make the first offer, or whether you make the first offer. And there are advantages that go both ways, and it depends on the situation. But the advantage of them making the first offer is, maybe they're going to make a higher offer than you even were going to ask. So when there's a lot of uncertainty in the situation, it's usually better to invite them to make the first offer. But if you've really mapped it out, really thought about all the interests and the independent criteria for deciding what's fair, like market value and so on, you've mapped it out. There's some advantage in you making the first offer because you anchor it. You kind of create a kind of expectation. You anchor it. And you can anchor it, if there's a range, for example, of what's fair, you could anchor it on the high side of that range. And generally speaking, in negotiations, people who aim high, not unrealistically high, but high in the fair range, tend to do better than people would aim low. compatible. In other words, there are three kinds of interests, if you want to think about it. There are interests that you have shared interests, and those are easy. When you have shared interests, you can work together. There are interests that are opposed, completely opposed, diametrically opposed. A dollar for you means a dollar less for them. And then there are interests which is often overlooked, which are simply differing interests. Like going back to that library window case. They have different interests. One was interested in fresh air, and one was interested in no draft. At the level of positions, there was incompatibility. I want an open window, I want a closed window. In this case, a half-open window would have satisfied neither man. It would have been too much draft, not enough fresh air. And that's what we often try to do in negotiations. We look for the midway point. The midway point is not necessarily the optimal point. In this case, in that case of the library window, they went for a win-win solution, a mutually satisfactory solution, which was an open window in the next room that satisfies each one. And so that's what you're looking for. But identify, where are the differing interests, where they seem compatible. And then let's imagine you've done all that. And there's a lot of work to be done then, because you've got to be patient and persistent. You may find out things. I've seen a lot of situations where people thought it was absolutely impossible, but they yield to patient, persistent negotiation. But one of the key things in negotiation, one of the first questions you ought to ask yourself, after asking yourself what are your interests, before you even address the other side's interests, you need to figure out what are your interests, and that's what you can do on the balcony. The other question you should ask yourself on the balcony is, a very important question to my mind in negotiation is, what is my BATNA? Now, BATNA is an acronym that stands for, what is my best alternative to a negotiated agreement? In other words, what's my walkaway? It's the answer to the question of, if I cannot reach agreement with the other side, what course of action am I going to follow to pursue my interests? If I can't land this job, can I get another job? If I can't work with this customer, can I get another customer? So knowing your BATNA is critical because it gives you the confidence that if this is, if the negotiated, if in fact they're totally incompatible, you have another way. It's not negative thinking, it's alternative positive thinking. And it's absolutely key because if you think about negotiation, what's the purpose of negotiation? Most people would say, to reach agreement. I don't quite see it that way. I see the purpose of negotiation as how do you satisfy your interests? Better than you could by not negotiating. In other words, better than you could by pursuing your BATNA. So your BATNA is your benchmark. And if you can improve your BATNA, you can improve the amount of power that you have in that negotiation. Because if you have a good BATNA, if you've got a great other job offer, then, then you're going to improve your ability to negotiate this one. So it's, the key concept in negotiation, when you're preparing for the negotiation, is think through your interests, think through your BATNA, and then think through the other side. Yeah, let's see. Right now, let me think of an example. One example is the international example where I'm working right now. The Civil War, and I'm working in a government where there's been civil war going on for about 50 years, and there's a guerrilla movement. And what I asked the government officials, the government negotiators, the president, and so on, with whom I was working, was first question is, well, let's write out the other side's victory speech. In other words, let's imagine the guerrillas agree to surrender their arms and whatever it is, end the war. How are they going to explain this to people about why they're ending a war that's gone on for 50 years in which they've lost all these people? How are they going to justify that? And I asked the president's brother, actually, who had a a real good sense of their thinking. He was a former leftist himself, and I asked the president's brother to, write out that victory speech and deliver it. And, he delivered the victory speech, and what was clear from that victory speech, that one thing that was going to be really important for them was their dignity. They could not be seen to be surrendering. Their dignity, their respect had to be given. And so what that did was it reinforced for us that from the very beginning, the way you approach them and the way to open up the negotiations was to stress from the beginning, we're not looking for you to surrender. This is not a defeat. We will respect you. And to give them a lot of that respect, which helped really, first of all, it helped hugely in initiating the initial talks, secret talks that we initiated, and in the public negotiations. It's been a key, is to really stress that theme of dignity, and that came out of thinking through the victory speech and how they could justify to their comrades, as it were, why they were laying down their arms. And the negotiation is going well, still ongoing, but I hope that there will be a peace finally within a few months.
Greg, Boston again? Sure. Thanks a lot. This is an awesome topic. So this is a question which I can emphasize with, I do it all the time. I think going after the first couple you said, the balcony and the listening part. And I know it for myself, especially if I have less time and, at least stored in my head of I have, I don't have a lot of time to spend with that person, and I just don't ever in their position. It's easier for us to react. So I guess the point of taking a deep breath, and even if it's a second or two, other strategies when you feel that pressure of kind of time around, what you see effective of helping them listen or not react.
Yeah.
Outside of what you said.
Yeah, well, one is, I've trained some hostage negotiators, like hostage negotiators there in the city of New York, for example. It used to be like 30 years ago, the standard way that police would deal with hostage situations in the city of New York and other big cities was John Wayne style, like in the movies, You've got 3 minutes to come out with your hands up, and then 3 minutes with a laugh, in you go, the tear gas, guns out, blazing. Often it's not the hostage dead, the hostage taker's dead, a policeman's dead, whatever. Very costly. And now what they've learned to do is they have professional hostage negotiators. So they send in a SWAT team, for sure, that's the BATNA, just in case. But the professional hostage negotiators, what they do is they listen. And they get on the phone with their hostage taker. They listen, they try to put themselves in their shoes, they try to understand that you want to how about a hot pastrami or whatever. They offer them things. But the thing what they do is, and this comes back to your question, is they don't do it alone. So in a very typical situation, there are always like 7, 8, 9, 10 people. One person's talking, 9 people are listening. You have 9 people on the balcony thinking, what's the next step? What do we need? Should we get a hold of that person's mother or father or someone to talk to them? They're thinking all the time. So if you don't have a lot of time, as in these situations where someone's life is on the line and the stakes are very high and there's a huge pressure, have a partner. Hostage negotiators never negotiate alone. They may be very skilled, but they know that they get sucked in, they get reactive, they get, they're so concerned about, someone dying. You don't sometimes negotiate your best, so they get pulled out. So think about bringing in a partner, negotiating with a partner in a difficult situation. That person can serve as your balcony in a high-stakes negotiation, so that you don't react in a way that doesn't serve your interest.
Kevin, you get?
Best way to create urgency is to look for natural deadlines that force decisions. In other words, if you just arbitrarily say this has got to be done, 2 days from now, it's just your will. It's totally arbitrary. And then someone says, well, that's just your will. My will's different. But if you look for things that are natural, like there's a board meeting which is only quarterly where we're going to have to make this decision, and that's next Tuesday, that's a natural deadline. So look for things that help force those decisions. And you can even create them. You get the box, for example, that something that's it's not dependent on your will alone. It's something that's more independent, can help. The other thing I would say is, generally speaking, in terms of urgency and time, because time is of the essence these days, is there's a paradox about, negotiation takes time, and so it seems like I don't have the time to negotiate. But one of the biggest mistakes I find is that people, in a rush, they leave out consulting with other critical players. And because they say, I don't have time to consult them, and I don't have time for any of this stuff. And so what they do is they go straight and they make the decision right there, and then they go back to their people, the other departments, they say, wait a minute, you never consulted us, we're not in it. And then there's an argument, and then it ends up taking twice as long than if you consulted them in the first place. So the motto of negotiation, because time is of the essence, is there's a paradox. And the paradox is, if you want to go fast, you have to go slow. It's almost like, it's like being in sports, sports players, like a champion tennis player. They learn to, because things are happening so fast, they learn to slow it down in their mind so that ball is coming slowly so they can kind of see it. And you need to do the same thing in negotiation, because things are coming at us very fast, but it means, it's like, I have a friend who's an emergency room surgeon. His favorite thing everything's going very fast time. His favorite saying is to say, slow down, we're in a hurry. That's the paradox.
San Francisco? Another question we had was related to once an agreement is made and both sides stop making certain agreements, and then you find out the solution really isn't as optimal as one thought. How do you approach coming to another agreement or something?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I caught the question. So, in other words, you're trying to reach an agreement, but things aren't working out?
Let's say an agreement was reached, and it was a non-optimal agreement or solution. How do you approach another party who now maybe is fine with the agreement, but say you personally have found things in how things were resolved?
Yeah. So, if I understand the question right, is how do you reopen the negotiation to find a better agreement than the one you reached, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, in that case, I think that, you could be very straight and very candid and take responsibility, don't blame the other side. The key thing in negotiation, the model of negotiation is, if you want to be hard on the problem, you have to be soft on the people. So don't blame them, say, you didn't tell me this or whatever it is, but take responsibility and say, look, we reached an agreement, and I believe right now that there's a way that we could actually improve this deal for both sides, for you and for us. We can actually meet your needs better. Would you be interested in hearing that? And then lay it out how you can actually expand upon before you divide it up. How you can actually make it better for both. You need to think about that, but there are often ways of doing that, and that's often today. In today's world, in the old days, people would make 30-year agreements or 10-year agreements. But now, because the environment, everything is shifting so fast, it's impossible to predict what's going to happen 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And so we're entering an era of what I would call continuous negotiation, which often means renegotiation. But it has to be renegotiation that, again, is good for both sides. It doesn't work so well to just reopen it and say, this is better for me, but it's worse for you. So they're not likely to agree to that.
Hi, I'm a summer career staff member at
have a role, have an impact on negotiation. And the question is, if you have the shorter end of the stick, for example, how do you negotiate? And how do you negotiate so as to level the playing field, so you can have an equitable negotiation, even if in the social world there are power distinctions, at the negotiating table those can be leveled or equalized. And ways of doing that is, first of all, excellent preparation. Really preparing all the more, because preparation uses power. The more you know your system uses power. The more you understand the other side's interest, it uses power. The more that you thought through your BATNA, and that BATNA is a key leveler. Because if you can improve your BATNA, then it doesn't matter how much power and privilege they have, there is what's called situational power. And in that negotiating situation, you're equal, even if outside the room in the society there are inequalities. You can build coalitions, for example, so that there's power in numbers that can, let's imagine you're dealing with, you're negotiating with a boss, for example. It's just you and the boss. There may be more power in having, 3 or 4 or 5 of you say, look, we've got a very serious issue that needs to be resolved. The boss is going to take it more seriously. So those two things can level and equalize, and we want to think about that power before you go into the negotiation and take it into account and see if there are ways to level the playing field so that you have an equitable and just negotiation. Well, the truth is I was an anthropology graduate student studying anthropology, which is the study of human beings, and obviously human beings we have a lot of conflict. And as I mentioned in the first meeting about my passion, I decided what am I going to work on? So I wanted to pick some big world problem, and I picked the question of war and peace, partly because it was just the time of the Cold War, and I couldn't fathom why we were prepared to risk the extinction of life on the planet for some temporary political conflict. And so I started, and so I went into that field and saying, okay, so how can human beings, at this moment in the evolutionary story of humanity, here we have this technological genius that's allowed us to devise these weapons of incredible destruction. We need the social, moral, emotional genius to be able to learn to live with each other so that we can live with the technology and we can use the technology for constructive purposes like next jump rather than destructive purposes. And so that's the dilemma that I decided to take as my lifelong question, and that led me into the field of negotiation. And it didn't really exist as a field then, but I was kind of curious. So I was just looking for anything that I could do to practice it, So there was there was a small claims judge who said, I've got an overload. I said, I'll be happy, try and mediate, if the carpet got stains on it or landlord-tenant dispute or whatever it was, and just start somewhere. And then I got involved, got an offer to get involved and help in a coal mine strike with the union and management. And it led to one thing after another. And so the key thing is just to take initiative. And the thing I just want to emphasize is anyone can do this. This is not rocket science. This is common sense in some sense. It's uncommon sense. It's common sense that's uncommonly applied. And all of us are negotiators, and this is really, what the fate of the world really depends on. The fate of, obviously, a company like NextJump is a result of a whole series of negotiations that happen through the course of the year with each other, with customers, and so on. But also in the larger society, if we're going to have a culture, what's the best gift we can give our children? A culture of peace and prosperity. And what's the tool for generating peace? It's negotiation. What's the tool for generating prosperity? It's negotiation. And we're all negotiators. And so anyone can do this. And I really encourage any of you who feel drawn to it to really don't think to be something special. Just go for it, and it will happen. You can negotiate. You can be mediators in your family, in your workplaces, in your communities, and that's really step by step. That's how we're going to build a better world and a better me plus you equals us.
Perhaps time for one more question. I have 44 start in New York or even Boston right now.
Bill, this was so incredibly helpful, I think, as both colleagues and also, in the relationships that we have in our lives. One question I had was, when it's not necessarily a clear negotiation, but it's sort of a conversation, and you feel like your needs are not being listened to, do you decide to just listen longer to understand that person's needs and to point it out? Like, what would be some of the responses you would have if you feel as one side of the conversation you're just sort of not being heard?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I define, as you can see, I define negotiation very broadly. So I would say that's a kind of negotiation. And even though it's not a formal negotiation, but in an informal sense, you're trying to influence each other, and you want that person to listen to you. By far and away, the best method to get someone to listen to you, obviously, is to listen to them first. If you can truly listen to someone, and just, hear them out. Now, some people like to talk for a long time. It's okay. Find a time when you've got that time to devote to it. And, listen for a moment. And then, when they're done speaking, surprise them by saying, is there anything more you wanted to add? And just, it might take an hour, or whatever it is that they've got. Just make sure that you get to the bottom of the barrel, because a lot of people in this world do not feel listened to. And often the people who are talking, who are not good listeners, have inside themselves this experiences that they were never listened to. And you listen to them, and you hear out their problem, and you maybe learn to paraphrase, which is repeat back what you heard them say in your words. So they really get understood. At some point, they say to themselves, wow, this person listens to me. This person understands my problem. And then they make this mental association. If that person understands my problem, which is really complicated, my problem is complicated, they must be intelligent. Then maybe that person is also worth listening to. I remember, just to give a practical example, there was a union management situation I was involved in where, they were about to go, there's been a strike. They were going to go on strike again. But management laid out all their demands. And the union, instead of just laying out all their demands, said, tell us more, and listen. And then management was so taken aback because it had never happened before the union had actually listened to them, that they then had space to listen to the union, and they created a different dynamic, and they averted the strike and reached an agreement. So it takes a little bit of investment, but it can work.
Bill, I want to thank you on behalf of all the guests we have, Secretary of Staff, Next Jumper. This is phenomenal, and I hope you're recovering quickly from the surgery you had. Appreciate the time you're giving us today. Thank you.
Charlie, it's been an enormous pleasure. I want to wish each and every one of you much success in all of your negotiations, whether it's at home, at work, in the world, and really encourage you to put these things which are quite simple in practice. I think it will yield results for you and yield results for your families and workplaces in the world. So
I will shoot you a note by next week. Everyone's probably negotiating double their salary.
That's right. No, and I'll just say one thing, which is, my aim, my vision is to try to give this away. So, if there's anyone at Next Jump who wants to help me spread this, and just give this out, particularly to people in the developing world, these kind of methods and techniques using the web, I would much appreciate that kind of help, because I'm thinking about how to give this away and spread these ideas more, make them more widely accessible to people.
I think that's a great ask, and we have a initiative called Code for a Cause, where individuals sign up that need to be an intensive 2 week coding for any cause. It's not a great one, so I'll throw it out there. Like Rebecca, who runs that initiative. We'll be hearing from Rebecca in a minute.
Great, that would be great, Charlie. I really hope so.
Thank you.
Okay, all my best, everyone.